former columnist from New York Times, as well as a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, senior fellow, and Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute of Law and Social Policy at the University of California, Berkeley Law School of Law, and a researcher associate of Economic Policy Institute. Richard has spent years documenting the evidence that government not merely ignored segregating and discriminatory practices in residential sphere and commercial, but also promoted it. Richard Rothstein.
As you all know, in the mid-20th century, this country decided to abolish racial segregation. You all know that in 1954 we abolished it in elementary and secondary schools. In the 1960s we passed laws abolishing segregation in everything from water fountains to buses to restaurants, public accommodations of all kinds. And yet we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. If we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day nothing much would look much different. It's a much more difficult thing to undo. Not that it's any less offensive, but it's more difficult to undo, and therefore we've adopted a rationalization, a national myth that excuses us from doing what we otherwise would know we have to do. And that myth is that residential segregation, unlike all the other segregations I mentioned, just sort of happened by accident. If it happened by accident, it can only be undone by accident. Now this theory that it all happened by accident, this rationalization that we use to avoid doing anything about it, has been embraced by the courts and by the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court calls this accidental segregation de facto segregation, and that means that we just are segregated in fact, but not in policy, an accident.
So what was the motivation to stay on the path of housing? Because you really do create an encyclopedia of what has happened and what continues to happen as it relates to people of color and housing.
The reason that the Supreme Court said it was a violation of the Constitution was that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated, and the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated de facto. So it's a violation of the Constitution to try to correct it. So I decided I had to look into this de facto business, and that's where this book started.
Have there been any attempts to try and do the right to return to an area that you used to live in, or the right to stay, for example, getting moved out in Berkeley if you're African American at this point and your parents are dying off and you have to sell your house? Have there been any attempts at such legislation, or would you recommend such policy?
Even if we enacted policies, which we should do, that ensure that a share of housing in a community was preserved for low and moderate income people, there would still be people displaced. So combining a preservation of a share of housing for low and moderate income families in communities that are gentrifying, and ensuring that those who are displaced have an opportunity to go to non-segregated neighborhoods, those two things need to be done together. Simply doing the first won't do enough, because you'll still have displacement, you'll still have Antiochs being created.
What is your prediction if we don't do anything, especially here in the Bay Area, where there is such disparity in the wealth and the jobs are here?
Continue to be riots in urban areas. The African American population continued to be constricted in concentrated areas of poverty. Despite that, there's also a more accurate, more passionate discussion in this country of the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow than we've ever before had in American history. The speech that the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, gave upon the removal of a statue to Robert E. Lee in New Orleans, even 2 years ago, it was inconceivable that a white elected Southern politician would make a speech like that. So things like that make me hopeful. The Black Lives Matter movement makes me hopeful. The popularity of writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones make me hopeful. And certainly I'm stunned by the reception to my book.